In the middle of the Neolithic, Europe was thriving. Farming had spread from the Near East to the Atlantic. Villages were growing. Trade networks stretched hundreds of kilometers. People built wooden temples, raised children, buried their dead with care. Then it stopped. Between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, something broke. Populations crashed. Giant settlements were burned and never rebuilt. Entire cities, pottery styles, burial traditions, language groups vanished from the archaeological record, and for decades, nobody had any idea why. There were theories: war, migration, climate, but none of them fit fully with the events, the scale, or the speed. Something was off. Civilizations don't just abandon their homes for no reason, not across a whole continent, not all at once. The answer came from a grave in Sweden, then another in Latvia, then dozens more. Not in the bones themselves, but in their teeth, deep in the pulp where blood once flowed. Scientists extracted something microscopic, something old. DNA from Yersinia pestis. The plague, but not the one we knew. This one was 3,000 years older than the Black Death. And it wasn't the end of the story. It actually just might have been the prologue. When scientists reconstructed the genome of a 5,000-year-old bacterium from a girl buried near the Volga River, they weren't expecting to find the earliest known strain of Yersinia pestis. But that's what it was, and she wasn't an isolated case. Dozens of other Neolithic and Bronze Age individuals, buried from the Baltic to the Caucasus, tested positive for ancient plague DNA. The genetic sequences show early, non-flea-borne strains of Yersinia pestis moving fast across vast distances, centuries before the classical pandemics of written history. So the question became, how did it move so fast? Remember, this strain wasn't hosted by fleas or rats. So how, or who? The obvious candidates were the Yamnaya. Around 3000 BC, these steppe herders exploded outward from the Pontic-Caspian region. Within a few centuries, their descendants, the corded ware and bellbeaker cultures, had replaced most Neolithic populations across Europe. Linguistically, genetically, even architecturally, the steppe left its mark. And Yersinia pestis seems to follow the same path. One theory, supported by genetic overlap, argues that the Yamnaya already carried the plague as they expanded. They didn't invent it, but they helped deliver it. The steppe migrations may have acted like a fuse, connecting distant populations that had evolved a resistance to the plague, opening new transmission routes, and triggering outbreaks in communities with no immunity. But there's another possibility that's been debated, that the plague came first. The earliest confirmed Yersinia pestis strains, like the one from Samara, appeared just before or during the initial Yamnaya expansions, and the timing aligns with the abrupt collapse of Neolithic megasettlements in Central and Eastern Europe. Some archaeologists now argue that it was the plague that emptied the land, depopulating the continent so severely that the steppe migrants didn't conquer Europe, because the place was already empty. They just walked into it. In that version of the story, Yersinia pestis wasn't their weapon, it was their opening. What's clear is that plague didn't stay local. Once mobility increased via migration, trade, or war, the pathogen moved with people, and the people who moved most were from the steppe. Whether they brought the plague or merely survived it better than others, the result was the same: an old world collapsing and a new one taking its place. For decades, the story of early European prehistory was told in modest terms: scattered villages, quiet farming communities, little drama. But then archaeologists started digging into the Ukrainian forest steppe and found something that changed the whole narrative. What they found weren't villages, but actual cities. At sites like Maidaneski, Taljanki, and Neblivka, sprawling settlements emerged, megastructures of the Neolithic world built almost 6,000 years ago. Some covered over 300 hectares, housing tens of thousands of people. Maidenetsky alone may have held as many as 50,000. That's more than the population of Uruk at its peak, and nearly the size of ancient Athens. There were no roads, no wheeled transport, no riding systems, but somehow these people built and maintained dense urban centers with intricate circular layouts, house rows, central temples, and planned perimeters. They constructed homes from clay and wood, raised livestock, cultivated grain, and traded raw materials across hundreds of kilometers. They also burned their houses, not by accident, but systematically. Archaeological layers show that houses were intentionally torched every 60 to 80 years, then rebuilt in place. Some interpret this as ritual renewal, others as sanitation, or both. Either way, the practice created layer upon layer of ash and debris, preserved like a time capsule, and inside those layers, something darker waited. There were no toilets in these cities, no drainage systems, no waste removal. Domestic animals lived close to humans. Grain silos attracted rodents, and those rodents carried fleas. Everything needed for an epidemic was present: population density, poor hygiene, high mobility, and no immunity. In the clay floors of these megasettlements, archaeologists began finding mass graves, burials with no clear trauma, multiple individuals laid together, mass graves. Then came the DNA testing. Some of those individuals carried Yersinia pestis. These cities had become incubators. The early form of the plague, lacking the flea-borne adaptation, could still spread through direct contact, droplets, or contaminated food. And when thousands of people shared space, water, and air, the pathogen didn't need advanced biology to move. It just needed hosts and population dense enough. Evidence from sites like Vertebra Cave in western Ukraine suggests that the communities began to decline rapidly after their peak. Homes were abandoned, settlement density plummeted, and unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, there was no transition to the next urban phase. The megasettlements were not replaced. They vanished quietly. Time did the rest, as the durability of material used for building was limited. What rose later were smaller, more fortified communities, built by different people with different gods, different tools, and in many cases, different DNA. At least the Neolithic cities weren't conquered by armies. They were dismantled by microbes. In a quiet field on the island of Öland in southern Sweden, archaeologists uncovered what looked like a typical Neolithic burial, a stone tomb sealed for millennia, filled with the remains of several dozen people. But this wasn't a peaceful family resting in death. It was a mass grave, 38 individuals, all related by blood. Men, women, children, grandparents, not stacked haphazardly, but placed with care, generation after generation. At first, there were no clear signs of violence, no arrowheads, no crushed skulls, no battle. But the violence was elsewhere. DNA could tell. Researchers extracted microbial material from the teeth and bones. What they found was unmistakable: Yersinia pestis, present in 32% of the individuals, not from a single outbreak, but from 3 genetically distinct waves, spaced out over more than a century. Imagine the feeling of recurring horror these people experienced, seeing this disease come back years after years. The first wave infected and killed members of the family. The survivors rebuilt, buried their dead. Then the plague returned. Different strain, same pathogen, killing another wave of the family. And then a third, more virulent, more widespread, possibly airborne. This final strain carried mutations in the bacterial genome linked to a respiratory form of plague, what we now call pneumonic. It's the most contagious version and the deadliest. It doesn't rely on fleas, it moves through droplets, breath, and close contact. In a tight-knit farming community, it would have been unstoppable. The archaeological layers support the genomic evidence. Between each plague wave, the tomb was resealed, then opened again. Each time, new bodies were placed with the old, and each time, fewer people returned. The family didn't just end, it was pruned slowly, repeatedly, until no branches remained. It's rare to catch a pathogen evolving in real time, even rarer to watch it devastate a single lineage over generations. But in this tomb, that's exactly what happened. The gravesite on Uland became a record of one family's extinction, written not in language, but in blood, bone, and bacteria. Across Eurasia, the Neolithic world was collapsing. Between the forest zones of Scandinavia and the river plains of Central Europe, archaeologists have found signs of abrupt cultural disappearance. Longhouse villages were abandoned, ceramics that had endured for centuries stopped being made, burial practices, once rich with symbolism, were replaced by hurried or missing graves. This wasn't a slow decline, it was sudden, widespread, and seemingly synchronized. In regions once dominated by large organized farming communities, such as the Cucuteni, Tripilia, and funnel breaker cultures, population density dropped by as much as 50% in a matter of centuries. Genetic data shows a sharp reduction in diversity. Skeletons from the period begin to show more signs of trauma, malnutrition, and stress. The funnel breaker culture of Germany, Denmark, and Poland, they buried their dead in stone tombs that still dot the European landscape today. But then, almost overnight, the megaliths go quiet, their pottery disappears, their settlements are replaced. One of the first large-scale farming societies in Northern Europe vanished around 2800 BCE. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture, who built some of the largest Neolithic settlements ever discovered, with sites like Talianki and Maidenetsky spanning over 300 hectares, by 3000 BCE, gone. For the time, these were unprecedented in scale, massive, complex proto-urban communities centuries before the first cities of Mesopotamia, and at first, archaeologists blamed it on environmental stress or internal conflict. But the timing now aligns too well with the spread of early plague strains. In some sites like Gokem in Sweden and Rashevatsky in Russia, entire extended families are found buried together, suggesting sudden, simultaneous death. In Latvia's Gaibakare site, a young woman and infant were buried side by side, and there's plenty more. And still very little written about why until the pathogen was found. When Yersinia pestis DNA began turning up in Neolithic remains across Europe, it reframed the story. The plague didn't just kill individuals, it destabilized entire societies that were just starting to emerge. In some places, people burned their homes and didn't rebuild them. In others, they buried their dead en masse without ceremony. There are sites where adults were buried without children, or children without adults, suggesting whole family units were wiped out because no one was there to bury the survivors next. Some settlements show signs of panic, unfinished tools, smashed ceramics, rapid abandonment. Others hint at violence, not invasion, but internal collapse. As people fled infected sites or fought over dwindling resources, social cohesion fractured. We have no written record of this transformation, no Hippocratic treatises, no clay tablets mourning the pestilence. But we have graves, a lot of them, scattered on a much larger scale. In sites across Central Asia, researchers began recovering Yersinia DNA from individuals buried during what should have been prosperous growing periods. Instead, these settlements were shrinking. Entire regional cultures, the Botai in Kazakhstan, the Afanasevo in Siberia, faded rapidly during the pathogen's expansion window. And then it jumped again, this time into China, then into Indus Valley, then eventually into the Roman and Byzantine worlds. As the trades and movements were slower at the time, so was the propagation of Yersinia. And paradoxically, Yersinia also participated in slowing down these trade routes by killing plenty of individuals along the way, but that didn't stop it from spreading. And the next time it made history, it was ready. Being hosted by so many different living beings leads to rapidly occurring mutations, some more advantageous than others, at least for the bacteria. And by the time it reemerged in the 6th century AD, it had transformed into a full-fledged industrial killer. This led to what was unfairly called the Plague of Justinian. Unfair for Justinian, I mean, because it's not like he invented it himself. He just reigned during the first outbreak. And what an outbreak! A death toll in the tens of millions. This wave specifically killed from a third to a half of all European population of the time. It started in 541 and had received the perfect welcome onboarding as volcanic eruptions and war were already wreaking havoc across Europe. I think you don't even start to imagine how tough things were at that specific time. 4 years prior, the year 537 has been designated by many researchers, especially medieval historian Michael McCormick, as the worst year to be alive in human history. Not 1349, when the Black Death ravaged Europe, and even not 1918, when the First World War and the Spanish flu literally amputated European societies of tens of millions of young and healthy adults. The combinations of everything that happened by 536 and before, till 541 and the Plague of Justinian struck a blow so hard that society started recovering only from 640, nearly a century later. And I mean just started, because the end of the Plague of Justinian was dated to 767, so plenty more death in between the two. But how do we even know all this? How do we pull a forgotten pandemic out of prehistoric graves and reconstruct its entire evolutionary arc? How did Yersinia pestis evolve that way? Well, it's not in any written record. It's been deducted from the gaps, the mass graves, the lack of traumatic injury, the burned settlements, and so on. And in the DNA of the dead and few survivors. Yersinia pestis wasn't always as we've known it from the books. Sure, it seems like it was always deadly, no matter the time we caught it, but there's key differences between strains over time. The early ones lacked one thing, the YMT gene, essential for flea-borne transmission. The genes it did possess, though, is the PLA, plasminogen activator, which enables the bacteria to invade the lungs, break down tissue barriers, and move quickly through the bloodstream. It's associated with pneumonic and septicemic plague, the most direct, the most aggressive, and the most contagious forms, and they were almost always fatal. But the issue for a disease, if you've ever played a game of Plague Inc., you'll notice right away is, you can't spread if you kill all the infected too fast for them to infect other people, and that's exactly what happened back then. In the absence of modern medicine, the three main forms of plague, bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic, had average mortality rates reaching 93%. Septicemic plague could kill in a day, often before symptoms fully appeared. Pneumonic plague, transmitted through droplets, could sweep through households in hours. Even bubonic plague, the slowest of the three, still killed the majority of those infected. Without antibiotics, there was no recovery. Only isolation or burial, a disease that altered the trajectory of entire populations. And by 3,800 years ago, that's exactly what it did. Yersinia had acquired the YMT gene necessary for flea and rat gut survival. So it had evolved from a limited human-to-human pathogen. It could only thrive in settlements. Once it scattered, the spread was cut off. But now, with the YMT gene allowing the bacteria to survive in fleas and rat guts, even if the settlements were deserted, burned, and sanitized, the rodents and fleas would keep on following the survivors anyway. or find new food sources into close settlements. And this new Yersinia pestis 2.0 also came with a full arsenal of immune-dodging adaptations, delayed detection, and increased infection rates. When the Bronze Age arrived, it was already killing with industrial efficiency. With the development of major trade networks that emerged across Eurasia, the pathogen was now perfectly tuned for transit. It could travel by cart, camel, or ship. It could live in warehouses, under floorboards, or in a flea cocoon waiting for warmth. So when it struck in the 6th century, and again in the 14th, and again in the 19th, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was just an upgraded version of that Neolithic killer. But what did we really lose during these events? Before the collapse, Neolithic Europe looked nothing like the world that followed. At sites like Maidnetsky and Telzhanki in modern-day Ukraine, homes were built in concentric rings, remarkably uniform in size and layout. There were no palaces, no elite residences, just rows of near-identical dwellings, carefully arranged across vast landscapes. On the scale of mega-settlements, you could think there were at least a few homes that should be bigger, but not here. These were rivaling early Mesopotamian cities in size, yet without defensive walls or militarized boundaries. At the center of many sat monumental wooden structures interpreted as communal temples, spaces likely used for ritual rather than control. The society that built them appears to have been organized around cooperation, not domination. Burial practices matched this pattern. In cultures like Funnelbreaker and Tripoli, graves typically lacked rich differentiation. While some individuals were buried with beads, tools, or ceramics, the offerings were modest and widely distributed. There is little evidence for social stratification or inherited status. Power, if it existed, was not encoded in wealth or warfare. These were communal worlds held together by shared ritual and symbolic order. Then something shifted. In the centuries that followed the Neolithic decline, new cultures emerged across Europe. The corded ware, the bellbreaker, and the early Bronze Age Unitice. Their settlements were smaller, often fortified. Their economies were increasingly specialized, and their dead were no longer buried as equals. Graves now told a different story. A few individuals, mostly male but not limited to, were laid to rest with prestige items, bronze daggers, drinking horns, amber beads, gold ornaments. Others were buried with nothing at all. The contrast is sharp and unmistakable. Social inequality had arrived, and it extended into death. Ancient DNA makes this even clearer. In Central and Western Europe, the genetic landscape changed rapidly. Populations with Neolithic ancestry were largely replaced by groups carrying genetic markers from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. In some regions, as much as 3/4 of the local gene pool was overwritten. The transition was demographic, not just cultural. More telling still was what happened to the Y chromosome. While maternal genetic diversity remained relatively stable, male lineages narrowed dramatically. A small number of patrilines began dominating entire regions, suggesting a shift toward rigid patrilineal inheritance. This was not a migration of families, it was a restructuring of power. I did a more detailed video on the topic. Feel free to go check it out by clicking on the top right. At the same time, the landscape itself changed. Defensive architecture began to appear for the first time in millennia. Settlements were now surrounded by ditches, ramparts, or palisades. Territory mattered. Control of resources became central. Technological change accelerated. Bronze replaced stone, and with metallurgy came new hierarchies. Access to copper, tin, and the knowledge to fuse them into weapons and tools created new classes of power. Trade routes expanded, but they flowed through the hands of those who controlled the metals. And in the background, myths shifted too. As Indo-European languages spread, so did their symbolic worlds. Pantheons of sky gods, warrior heroes, and patriarchs. These stories emphasized lineage, conquest, and divine right, values that echoed the new social order rising in their wake. None of this happened overnight. It unfolded over generations, but the change is visible, from houseplans to burial goods, from fortifications to genetic lineages. A communal egalitarian world, ritual-rich, artistically vibrant, structurally flat, was replaced by one that prioritized hierarchy, defense, inheritance, and control. This shift laid the foundations of the world to come. Property, patriarchy, political boundaries, inequalities all have roots in the aftermath of that ancient transition. The societies that rose from the silence didn't just survive the collapse, they redefined what civilization would mean. But more than civilizational change, this left a deeper mark within each and every one of us. We often think of ancient pandemics as isolated catastrophes, events that came, killed, and left no trace but trauma, when really it's quite the opposite. Pandemics, as you might have learned from our collective experience with COVID-19, always leave antibodies within the survivor's organism. The same goes for Yersinia pestis. Genetic studies across Eurasian populations show signs of intense natural selection around genes associated with immune response. In particular, alleles involved in macrophage activation, inflammatory control, and pathogen recognition show dramatic frequency changes after the Neolithic period. These shifts aren't subtle. They point to a species-wide immunological reshaping. Natural selection had turned the plague into a pressure test. Those who survived weren't just the isolated ones that took back the land later. Most of them had a greater immune response to face the infection. One study of the European genomes found that certain variants of the ERAP2 gene, part of the system that processes foreign proteins for immune presentation, rose in frequency after the Black Death. But the pattern may have started much earlier. Maybe it already started with his first plague, and throughout history, the phenomenon was greatly emphasized as humans regrouped, built cities, and contracted more and more disease that spread on an ever larger number of people. Another study found that ancient strains of Yersinia pestis likely exerted pressure on the toll-like receptor pathways, key components of early pathogen defense. This implies the impact of this bacteria was much more important than first thought. Entire populations may have been sculpted genetically by exposure to this bacterium. Survivors then passed on the tales and stories of those who didn't make it, and the aftermath of the whole tragedy, and also a whole new immunological baselines. But there's a second kind of echo: demographic. Ancient DNA has revealed that several Eurasian populations went through pronounced bottlenecks after the Neolithic collapse. Genetic diversity plummeted, particularly in male lineages. Some regions lost almost all traces of the pre-collapse Y chromosome diversity, replaced almost entirely by a few dominant lineages associated with post-steppe migrations. It wasn't just a plague, it was a filter. Whether the plague was the cause or not, it at least facilitated the transition from existing populations to the Yamnayas who arrived after. Most likely, Yersinia pestis arrived before or at the same time as the newcomers from the steppes. It led to a great drop in already settled populations, both male and female. The Yamnayas then exterminated or enslaved the few men left, and integrated the women and children that survived. Entire languages, traditions, and family lines disappeared, alongside immune profiles, cultural practices, and symbolic systems that no longer had bearers. The plague didn't just erase people, it reshaped who would exist afterward, and Western societies inherited this structure of power. This is why some researchers describe Yersinia pestis not simply as a pathogen, but as a silent architect of history, a hidden force that redrew the genetic and cultural map of a continent. It's impressive to see how much this single bacteria has changed our history at so many points in time. It did back in the Neolithic. It did during Justinian's reign. And it did during the Black Death events. This last one was dramatic and brutal, but especially well documented. But its deep foundations may have been laid millennia earlier, during a quieter apocalypse we're only now beginning to detect. That's the silence we're carrying with us every day. In the genes we inherit, in the diversity we've lost, in the traits we didn't know were forged under pressure, Yersinia pestis has left its mark, not just as history, but as biology. And perhaps the craziest part is that we didn't know it until just recently. The oldest pandemic we've ever faced didn't even leave us any stories, only genomes. For thousands of years, no chronicles or legends, just archaeological sites, abandoned cities, sealed tombs, and microscopic traces in teeth. Only now, with ancient DNA and global genomic datasets, are we beginning to understand how deeply the microscopic, especially Yersinia pestis, shaped human history through death and through the aftermath as well. It ended lives, lots of them, but it also redrew maps and led to culture's collapse. And in its wake, it helped build the foundation of the world we live in today. If this story reframed how you think about pandemics or made you look at human history a little differently, consider supporting the channel. Leave a comment. What part of this forgotten plague surprised you the most? Was it the family buried 3 times? The cities without walls? The population replacement? Like the video if it helped connect dots you didn't know were connected. Share it with someone who still thinks the Black Death was the worst plague ever. And subscribe if you want more stories that live between extinction and emergence. This channel exists because of your curiosity, your clicks, your questions, your time. Thanks for being part of it. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes.